Hello, I'm Martha Raddatz, ABC News Chief Global Affairs Correspondent, and I am joined today by New York Times White House correspondent Peter Baker, author of the new book, Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining us. And because we believe all politics is social at This Week, we are going to ask Peter some of the questions that our Facebook readers and others submitted on Facebook. First of all, I get to ask the first question. Why'd you write this book at this time?
This is an important time, actually, to write this book. Look, we are still living with and debating the legacy of President Bush and Vice President Cheney, and will for a lot of years. And I wanted to go back and find out what was really like going on there. And what's always surprising to me as a journalist, and Martha, you know this, we get about 5–10% maybe of what's really going on. Have a chance to go back 5 years later, you discover it isn't everything you thought it was. And one of the most important things about this was how different the relationship and partnership between President Bush and Vice President Cheney really was compared to the mythology that was created out there.
The first question comes from R.L. Estrella, who asks, was Dick Cheney really calling the shots?
I think we try to burst that overly cartoonish version of their relationship. Did Dick Cheney call the shots? No. Was he very influential? Yes, particularly in the beginning. He had a rather dominant force in the White House, but he wasn't the dominant force. Even in the beginning, it was George W. Bush's White House. He followed a lot of what Cheney recommended to him because he was already inclined to go those directions.
And did the relationship change over those years? Did President Bush push Cheney away more?
It did. It changed actually rather drastically by the second term. By that point, they're drifting apart. The president is upset with what's going on in Iraq. He's upset that the second term, he feels the need to repair relations with Europe, with allies, and he begins going in a different direction. And they, in the end, are apart on all sorts of issues, not just Iran and Syria, but things like Lebanon, gay rights, gun rights, climate change, a whole panoply of issues in which they are seeing things not eye to eye the way they did in the early days.
Bernie Loradich asks, what is the worst falsehood about the Bush-Cheney relationship that was promulgated by the mainstream media?
Well, I do think that we oversimplified it. I think we took what was a fair thing to say, which is to say that Dick Cheney is unlike any vice president before him in his stature, gravitas, and influence in that White House in the early years in particular. And then we magnify that to be, aha, he's the puppet master. He's really running things. I don't think that's true. I don't think anybody who was in that White House day to day thought that was, what they saw in those meetings. Did some people have great fights with Dick Cheney? Absolutely. He was on a different point of view than a lot of people like Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, and so forth. But at the end of the day, George W. Bush, I did a lot of interviews, about 400 interviews for this book. I haven't found anybody who said that George W. Bush ever told them that Dick Cheney made him do something he didn't want to do.
Sarah Willers-Westendorf asks, do Bush and Cheney have regrets about getting us into the war? I know there were certainly regrets about the direction it was taking.
I think it's a no. At least they've not expressed that to anyone I've talked to. I did interview Vice President Cheney a couple times. He does not have regrets about that. He believes it was important to take out Saddam Hussein, even though the weapons turned out not to be there. They do have regrets, at least certainly President Bush does, about the way it went about, that the planning wasn't as fully realized as it ought to have been, that they didn't move quicker when Iraq went bad to try to turn things around. They did agree on the surge, but Vice President Cheney was not a major player in the surge initially because his best friend, his very good friend, Donald Rumsfeld, was still at the Pentagon, who was responsible for the old strategy, did not agree with the surge at first. And I think Cheney, until
he didn't want to get rid of Rumsfeld.
He didn't want to get rid of Rumsfeld, and it was only after Rumsfeld resigns at the end of the 2006 elections does Cheney begin to become more of an advocate for a surge.
Okay, Peter, this is what we call the lightning round. Which website do you visit every day besides the NewYorkTimes.com?
Well, ABC News, of course.
Oh, of course. Yeah, nice
absolutely.
Try.
No, that's true.
Okay,
and I have a long list, actually. I really do. I try to get everything from foreignpolicy.com to Huffington Post, Daily Caller, the whole gamut of things, because that's the great thing about the web.
Most difficult part of covering the White House. I'll keep my mouth shut here.
I think the hard part about covering the White House is trying to actually find out what really goes on there. It's a really closed place, even at the best of times, and there are very few people who are available to you to be sources that you'd like to know more about.
One piece of advice for young journalists.
Don't take no for an answer. That was the advice I was given by my high school journalism teacher, 25, 30 years ago, and I think it's been good advice.
It's great advice. Thank you for joining us, Peter Baker. And thank you to everyone who submitted their questions. You can read an excerpt of Peter's book at our website, and be sure to follow This Week on Twitter at ThisWeekABC, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/thisweek. Have a great day.